Hello everyone, it is Evely, and today I'm going to tell you a story. Enjoy your viewing and good luck. The forest swallowed them whole. Its ancient canopy loomed like a vaulted ceiling, blotting out the weak sunlight. Twisted roots clawed through the damp earth, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and decay. For days, the group of explorers had ventured deeper into the uncharted wilderness, guided by whispers of a hidden temple that local legends claimed was cursed. Most dismissed the stories as superstitions, but they couldn't ignore the unnerving tales of villagers who ventured too close and returned, raving mad, or didn't return at all. There were 5 of them. Dr. Elise Marin, an archaeologist with a reputation for chasing dangerous leads. Mark, the stoic survivalist. Nadia, a folklore expert who carried a notebook filled with hand-scrawled warnings from local shamans. Luis, a tech-savvy skeptic armed with a drone and gadgets. And Jonah, the youngest, eager to prove himself but quick to reveal his nerves. They had all signed up for the promise of discovery, but now the oppressive silence of the forest was chipping away at their resolve. It was late afternoon when they finally stumbled upon it. A vine-covered structure jutting from the earth like the broken teeth of some long-dead beast. The temple was older than any of them could have anticipated, its stone walls etched with carvings worn smooth by time. Strange symbols, unfamiliar and jagged, spiraled upward in patterns that seemed almost alive. The air grew colder as they approached, and an unnatural stillness settled around them. "Here it is," Elise whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and dread. "The Temple of Nixoth. Looks like it hasn't been touched in centuries," Mark muttered, brushing a hand against the weathered stone. His fingers came away slick with moss. "Good. Let's keep it that way," Nadia said, her tone sharper than intended. She flipped through her notebook, her eyes darting over sketches of similar symbols. "The locals said this place is a prison. Something about an artifact that should never be disturbed. Every legend has a kernel of truth," Luis said with a smirk, though his gaze lingered uneasily on the carvings. "Let's not freak ourselves out." But the longer they stood there, the more it felt like the temple was watching them. The entrance was a gaping maw of darkness, the doorway framed by 2 stone pillars carved with monstrous, skeletal faces. Jonah shined his flashlight into the void, revealing a long corridor that sloped downward. The walls were lined with murals, the figures within twisted in grotesque agony. At the center of each mural was a black circle, scratched so deeply into the stone that it seemed to devour the light. "This feels wrong," Jonah murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just keep moving," Elise said, though her own nerves were beginning to fray. "We came here for answers." The deeper they ventured, the colder it became. Their breaths misted in the air, and an oppressive weight settled over them, making it harder to move, to think. Mark took the lead, his machete slicing through thick cobwebs that hung like ghostly veils. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the stone floor and the distant drip of water. Then came the whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind, soft, lilting murmurs that rose and fell like a half-forgotten lullaby. But there was no wind this deep underground. The sound grew louder as they continued, the words unintelligible but maddeningly persistent, as though something just beyond the edge of perception was trying to speak directly into their minds. "What the hell is that?" Luis hissed, his flashlight jerking across the walls. "Keep it together," Mark snapped, though his own hand hovered near the knife at his belt. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, its ceiling vanishing into shadow. At its center stood a stone pedestal, and upon it rested the artifact. The air around it seemed to hum with tension, a barely perceptible vibration that made their teeth ache. The object was small, no larger than a fist, and shaped like a jagged shard of obsidian. Its surface shimmered with an oily iridescence, and faint symbols writhed across it like living things. As they drew closer, the whispers grew deafening, echoing off the walls in an unholy cacophony. Is that it?" Jonah stammered, his face pale. Elise approached the pedestal, her hand trembling as she reached for the artifact. "This is it. This is what the legends spoke of." "Don't touch it," Nadia snapped, stepping forward. You don't know what you're dealing with. The shamans said it's cursed, Elise. They said a lot of things. Elise cut her off. We're here to learn the truth, not pander to superstition. The moment her fingers brushed the artifact, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was as if the air itself had been sucked from the room, leaving a void that pressed against their ears and chests. Elise held the artifact up to the light, her eyes wide with wonder. And then the screaming began. It wasn't coming from any of them. The sound echoed from all around them, a piercing, soul-shredding wail that seemed to rise from the walls, the floor, the very stone of the temple. The carvings on the walls began to shift, the twisted figures writhing as though trying to claw their way free. Put it back, Nadia screamed, her voice barely audible over the noise. For God's sake, Elise, put it back. But Elise stood frozen, her eyes locked on the artifact as if she couldn't hear them. Her expression twisted into one of horror, and blood began to seep from her nose. Mark grabbed her by the shoulders and yanked her away from the pedestal, the artifact tumbling from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The moment it hit the ground, the screaming stopped. But the silence was short-lived. The floor beneath them began to shake, and cracks spiderwebbed across the chamber. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths, vibrating through their bones. The air grew thick with the stench of rot and sulfur, and the shadows at the edges of the room began to move, slithering, growing, taking on shapes that were almost human but horribly wrong. "Run!" Mark shouted, shoving Elise toward the corridor. They bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they sprinted through the dark. The shadows pursued them, their distorted forms flickering in and out of existence. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, drowning out the sound of their own footsteps. Jonah tripped, falling hard against the stone floor. Luis skidded to a halt and hauled him to his feet, but not before one of the shadows reached him. Its elongated fingers brushed his arm, and he screamed, a high, animalistic sound that made the others stop in their tracks. When they turned, they saw the flesh on Luis's arm blackening, his veins turning a sickly green as if something was spreading through him. "Leave me," Luis gasped, clutching his arm. "Just go." But Mark grabbed him, dragging him forward. Not a chance. When they finally burst out of the temple, the forest was wrong. The once lush greenery was now withered and gray, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches reaching for the group like skeletal hands. The air was thick with an unnatural fog that clung to their skin, and the whispers had followed them, faint but persistent. Elise clutched her head, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. "We shouldn't have touched it. We shouldn't have. We need to get out of here," Mark growled, cutting her off. "Now." But as they stumbled through the forest, it became clear that the curse was not confined to the temple. The ground beneath them pulsed as though alive and distant. Inhuman cries echoed through the fog. The artifact had awoken something ancient, something hungry, and it was following them. The forest closed in tighter around them. The trees gnarled and warped like tortured sentinels. The mist thickened, and every step seemed to sink them deeper into a living nightmare. They ran without direction, their only thought to put as much distance as possible between them and the cursed temple. But the whispers never stopped. They skittered through the fog like nails dragged across glass, always just behind them, breathing down their necks. Sometimes, the voices sounded mournful, like the cries of lost souls. Other times, they were mocking, the distorted echoes of their own voices laughing at them. Jonah stumbled to a halt, clutching his chest. "We're going in circles," he cried, his voice shrill. I swear we've passed that same tree 3 times. "No," Mark snapped, though his tone carried little conviction. "We just need to keep moving. There has to be a way out." "There's no way out," Luis muttered from behind them, his voice weak. He had grown pale, the veins in his arm now spidering out in a web of black and green. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his eyes were glassy. "We're already dead. It won't let us leave." "Shut up," Mark barked, his own fear boiling into anger. "We're not dead. We just need to focus." Elise, who had been walking ahead, froze. Her flashlight beam trembled as it illuminated something ahead. A clearing, though it was like no clearing they had ever seen. The trees there were twisted into impossible shapes, their trunks spiraling upward like smoke caught in a freeze frame. The grass was blackened and brittle, and at the center of the clearing was a figure. It was cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. The thing was massive, its hunched frame pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to drink in the light around it. Its head was crowned with antlers, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, like embers buried in ash. None of them dared move. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, deafening voice that spoke directly into their minds. The language was alien, its syllables jagged and unnatural, but its meaning was clear. "You have stolen what is mine." The figure shifted, its long, clawed hand extending toward them. The shadows around it writhed, taking on monstrous forms that surged toward the group like a wave. "Run!" Mark bellowed, snapping them out of their paralysis. They scattered, crashing back into the forest. The fog seemed thicker now, its tendrils clawing at their faces and limbs. Nadia fell behind, her breath hitching in panic as the whispers grew louder in her ears. She turned a corner and stopped dead. Before her stood Elise, her back to Nadia, holding the artifact in her trembling hands. "Elise!" Nadia screamed. "What are you doing? We have to keep moving." But Elise didn't respond. She was muttering under her breath, her voice low and frantic. As Nadia stepped closer, she realized Elise wasn't muttering. She was repeating the whispers, the alien words spilling from her mouth in a monotone chant. "Elise, stop!" Nadia grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. The sight made her stomach lurch. Elise's eyes were black, the irises completely swallowed by darkness. Blood streamed from her nose and ears, and her lips cracked as the words continued to pour out of her, unstoppable. The artifact in her hands pulsed with a sickly green light, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter with each repetition of the chant. "Elise, put it down," Nadia begged, shaking her. But Elise's body suddenly convulsed, her head snapping back unnaturally. The chant ceased, and Elise's mouth stretched open in a silent scream as the light from the artifact surged, engulfing her. When it faded, Elise crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Nadia staggered back, tears streaming down her face. She turned to run, but she wasn't alone. A shadow loomed behind her, and before she could scream, it swallowed her whole. Mark, Jonah, and Luis pressed on, their lungs burning with exertion. The whispers seemed to grow weaker the further they got from the temple, but the forest itself was against them. Roots erupted from the ground, tripping them. Branches clawed at their faces, drawing blood. And then there were the things in the mist, distorted shapes that flitted just out of sight, whispering their names. Luis collapsed against a tree, his breathing ragged. His infected arm had swollen grotesquely, the flesh dark and oozing. I can't go on," he rasped. "You don't have a choice," Mark said, hauling him to his feet. "We're getting out of here." But as he pulled Luis forward, Jonah let out a strangled cry. Mark turned just in time to see the younger man being dragged into the fog, his screams cutting off abruptly. Mark and Luis froze, their eyes wide with terror. They could still hear Jonah's voice, but it was warped, distorted, as if something was mimicking him. "Mark, help me." The voice was close, too close. Mark grabbed Luis and bolted, ignoring the pained gasps of the man struggling to keep up. They crashed through the forest, their flashlights flickering wildly. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. Finally, they broke through the fog into another clearing. But what lay before them made Mark's stomach drop. It was the temple. "No," Luis whispered, shaking his head. "No, we didn't turn around. How are we back here?" The ground beneath them shuddered, and the pedestal inside the temple began to glow faintly. The artifact was back, resting exactly where it had been, as though Elise had never taken it. Mark turned to Luis, his face grim. "This place is messing with us. It wants us to put it back." "I'm not going in there," Luis said, clutching his arm. "I'm not going back in that thing." But as he spoke, the forest came alive. The trees groaned, their branches twisting toward the clearing. Shadows poured from the fog like living tar, surging toward them with terrible speed. Mark grabbed Luis by the front of his jacket. "We don't have a choice." Dragging the half-conscious man behind him, Mark ran into the temple. The shadows followed, shrieking and clawing at their heels. When they reached the pedestal, Mark grabbed the artifact, its surface burning cold against his skin. "Go!" he shouted, shoving Luis toward the entrance. "I'll hold them off." "Mark, no. Go!" Luis hesitated, then staggered toward the exit. Mark turned to face the shadows, clutching the artifact tightly. The whispers were deafening now, screaming into his mind, but he forced himself to step closer to the pedestal. The shadows surged toward him, their forms twisting into monstrous shapes. Mark raised the artifact above his head, then slammed it down onto the pedestal. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the chamber. The shadows froze, their forms disintegrating into mist. The artifact cracked, a blinding light pouring from its center. Mark barely had time to scream before the light consumed him. When Luis stumbled out of the temple, the forest was silent. The mist had lifted, and the oppressive weight in the air was gone. But he was alone. He turned back toward the temple, its entrance now collapsed, sealed by rubble. He stood there for a long moment, his infected arm hanging limp at his side. Then he heard the whispers again, soft at first but growing louder. They were coming from within him. See you in the next video. Don't forget to support me.